Go.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You know, the board, the Federal Reserve Board, has proposed these regulations in an effort to implement the interchange fee provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act. Let me ask a simple question, starting with Mr. Kemper. How did the Federal Reserve do in writing this rule, in your opinion?
I think the Federal Reserve, as I mentioned, was hamstrung with some very specific language on what they can do on incremental costs, and I think they narrowed it. And I've talked, Missouri is the only state with two Federal Reserve districts, and I know both presidents very well, and I've talked with them. I think there's a lot of question on how, you know, how they came up with what they did, why they didn't include fraud, and why it was so narrow. But I think they took a very bad law and made it worse and narrowed it down. And that's, I think, I listened to Governor Raskin. I think you asked a lot of good questions about what are the costs that should be in there, and they're not in there.
So you don't think that the Federal Reserve did a good job in writing?
I think they did a very thorough job, but I think the outcome was not good. Right. And I don't think it's right either.
Thank you, Mr. Kemper. Mr. Cantor?
Thank you for that. I think the Federal Reserve has done a good job and a credible job of writing this rule. It is not everything that we would like it to be. As you heard, I think they have the room and should not have centrally fixed interchange fees whatsoever allowed anymore by the banks. But they did a good, credible job going through it, and it is substantial progress that will benefit everyone, in particular consumers. And I would note, just with respect to Mr. Carney's comment before, too, it's helpful to look. In Europe, they took a look at this question when they moved to a 0.2% debit interchange, which is lower than, a little bit lower than what the Fed proposed. And they found that there is no relationship between the fees that banks charge their customers, checking and otherwise, and the interchange fee. In fact, if there were, as interchange fees tripled in this country over the last decade, we would have seen bank fees on consumers fall dramatically. In fact, they didn't. Those increased dramatically, too, to $38 billion in overdraft, just to take one example.
Think they did well, Mr. Cantor?
I think they did well.
All right. And Mr. Michael?
Well, I think that, again, they have been hamstrung, and they had some options where they could have made some decisions. For example, in enforcing or requiring the enforcement of a two-tier system could be something they could have done. They've decided not to do. I think there's issues in the definition of the costs. It's not an incremental cost, it's really an operational cost, and it all has to be allocated out. But my operational costs are not being considered as part of the process. The final thing I'm going to say is they've acknowledged small exempt institutions will be dragged in. They've said that that's the reality of what's going to happen. But they haven't surveyed us. They haven't determined what our costs are and included those as part of their determinations.
Thank you. And Ms. Bloom?
Congressman, I think the Fed did not have enough time and so could not and did not do a thorough enough job. They didn't consider all of the costs. They didn't survey the small financial institutions, and they didn't include all of the costs that even the narrow statute should have allowed them to include, such as fraud costs, such as network fees, such as fixed costs, investment costs, to keep the infrastructure safe, sound, and secure.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Prensas?
I believe that the Federal Reserve is doing a proper job. Like I said, there might be more that has to be done, but we're in the right direction. The only comment I just want to make, so maybe we could get a down-to-earth grasp on this problem coming from a small business. If you have two flower shops within a 50-mile radius, those two flower shops can basically set their own prices. But now if you allow 4 of the flower shops to come into that area, there's going to be competition. Who benefits at the end of the day? It's the consumer. This is what could happen here. If they allow the competition to exist, where now 2 banks decide what these interchange fees are, at the end of the day, it's the consumer and the retailer who's going to benefit, including the banks.
Thank you, Mr. Prensas. Mr. Seltzer, briefly, please, because I'm running out of time.
Sure. I think the Fed is, from our perspective, has done a very thorough process. I know that we spent considerable time answering their questions in the fall, as did banks and other institutions. So from our perspective, they've done a very thorough job. There were things that we think the actual cost of the transaction is a bit lower than where the Fed came out. So we think the rates could be lower, but at the end of the day, we will trust the process, and in any event, we think that merchants and consumers in particular will benefit from their actions.
And just a very short follow-up question, if I may, Madam Chair. If the Dodd-Frank bill was presumably enacted or cobbled together in order to try and pull back our economy from the brink, were interchange fees a root cause of the financial crisis?
No, they weren't, Congressman. They had nothing to do with the financial crisis, and in fact, they're an engine for growth.
Yeah.
Dodd-Frank was supposed to be about protecting consumers, and the Durbin Amendment, unfortunately, will have the opposite effect by harming consumers. So it really was rushed and has no place as part of a consumer protection bill.
And we would not surprisingly perhaps disagree. Interchange fees, in fact, fed some lax underwriting standards on credit cards that were in fact terrible problems.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Mr. Watt?
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and